So our session now is called "The Future is Now: Digital Health." And this is an area that many of us were essentially plunged into during the pandemic because of the closure of healthcare facilities and having to do telemedicine and remote medicine. I can tell you that our community probably did not adapt to this quite well. There was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of misunderstanding. Some people did it well. Some people didn't. But we really wanted to understand how to move digital health forward. So we have 5 priority focus areas in NHF. One of those priority focus areas is in digital health. And that means that we're putting a special emphasis to understand what's needed from you, the people who live with an inheritable bleeding or blood disorder, so the subject matter experts with your lived experience, but also then what we can use that information to do is to understand how we create consumer education programs, medical education programs, influence public policy, influence payer issues, and ensure that we're getting, for example, telehealth paid for and reimbursed. But also, it's about what research needs to be done and closing research gaps. So all about engagement. So we're really, these priority focus areas are sort of taking that 360 view of each of these areas. The other priority focus areas are in future therapies. You can guess what that means today, but really looking at the time horizon for the future. Von Willebrand disease, rare and ultra rare bleeding disorders, and then mental health. And we wanted to make sure that we were shining a special light on these areas. And of course, digital health is one of those. So we're early in this journey of digital health as a community and as an organization. But we're really privileged today to have one of the world's experts in this area share with us his reflections on digital health. And that's Dr. Stanley Shaw, who's here. These are his disclosures. I have none. So these are the priority focus areas that I mentioned before. And these are really, again, to put that special emphasis on these particular areas where we believe there needs to be enhanced attention. If you have input into any of these areas, there's opportunities for community members to participate in these. We're always looking for additional input. Your input is critical to shaping these priority action teams. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Shaw to talk more about digital health. The future is now. Dr. Shaw?
Thanks very much, Len. I want to thank you and NHF for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I wanted to start just to get a sense of the room because this conference is impressively broad in terms of who comes and the segments of the ecosystem that are represented in the participants and the speakers. And so if you can go to this website, I hope you can see it at the top, www.menti.com. Enter that 8-digit code on the right. And so this is just to ask you, have you engaged in one of these digital transactions in the last year? So arranging travel, purchasing something online, or banking. So if you could just take a moment and we'll watch these accumulate. Well, I think you should be able to specify more than one. No? Okay, well, live and learn. So, okay. Let's let this run for another few seconds. So certainly purchasing something, but pretty good for all 3. Okay, terrific. So now, as you can see, there's pretty broad uptake in these different kinds of the consumer part of your existence. Now let's talk about the healthcare side of your existence. Same website. Hopefully, you're all primed and ready to vote. And if you could just choose one, if you can't vote for both. So I wish I could have asked you these questions kind of circa 2019 or early 2020. These are pretty impressively high numbers. More have done this than arranged travel online, for instance. I don't know, is anybody wearing something on their person right now, like a wristband or something? I'm seeing some hands. I think before the pandemic, for many of us, including myself as a cardiologist, you know, healthcare was probably one of the most analog experiences in our lives compared to different sectors. And in fact, the consulting company McKinsey surveyed different sectors of the economy. Don't worry about the numeric scale, but this is their sense on ranking different kinds of industry sectors according to how digitally savvy they are, how they use the technology. And you can see among the best are things that we asked about: financial services, retail, travel. And then at the top of the slide, bringing up the rear in terms of digital sophistication and utilization, the development of new pharmaceuticals or medical devices, and healthcare, right? And so why is that? It's a complicated question. Certainly we all see, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of devices, people are wearing them. We've got a couple of iPads and iPhones up here. There are barriers. And I'll just say that healthcare, maybe this will resonate with you. Healthcare is slow to adopt technologies, even if in retrospect, they seem like no-brainers and very important and fundamental. These are two paintings of Laennec, who invented the stethoscope, so a tool very near and dear to my heart. On the right is how people used to auscultate the heart, and you literally just put your ear on the patient's chest. And he developed this first stethoscope, which is really just a rolled up tube to listen from about a foot or so away. And this stethoscope was criticized for introducing distance between the patient and the doctor, right? So this is circa 1816, a concern that you could extrapolate all the way forward to 2022. Now, fast forward 80 years later to the late 19th century, with the invention of the X-ray in Germany. This is a graph of utilization of X-rays at Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital in the United States. X-rays were invented in 1895 at the far left. I'll tell you, 2 years later, this hospital bought its first X-ray machine. And then you can see basically nobody used it for about 15 years. And then utilization took off. And there were several factors that all worked together to increase uptake. One was that they figured out the compelling clinical use case, certainly broken bones, but maybe the occasional kidney stone. There were changes afoot in the medical profession. They ended up creating a new specialty, the precursor to what we now call as radiologists. There was a new business model. And so right around this time when uptake increased, they figured out a system so the person taking the X-ray got 75% of the fee and the hospital kept 25% of the fee. And, you know, this happened at a time when there was a cultural shift in what happened at a hospital, where people wanted to receive care and how. Before this time, if you were, let's say, middle class or above, healthcare came to you, the venerable house call. And if you were in a hospital, it was because you had something very long-term like tuberculosis, or you were indigent. And around this time, X-rays, the beginning of blood tests, urinalysis, the beginning of the medical record, all of these things about the same time made hospitals a place for the acute treatment and diagnosis of disease for the very first time. And so that helped galvanize uptake of new technologies. So now, as you think about where we are, if anything, the societal trend is in the other direction, right? People want more care outside of the downtown hospitals, and digital, the subject of today, is perhaps a real catalyst for enabling that. And so the reminder again is it's not just about the technology, but that these other factors, broader factors across the healthcare ecosystem, will determine the ultimate success of a new technology. And then finally, now 100 years later, after the invention of the 200 years after the invention of the stethoscope, let's say about 100 years after the uptake of radiology, we have the case of telemedicine. And we all know that it exploded during the pandemic. This was ready to go around 2000. So if you look just before 2000, there was Medicare reimbursement. There was a clinical trial for telestroke saying that you could beam the CAT scan and the physical exam of a stroke patient, let's say in a rural hospital, and a neurologist hundreds of miles away could say, yes, give a thrombolytic agent to bust up that clot, right? Nothing really happened in terms of uptake until the pandemic. And why is it? Again, it's these multifactorial across the system factors. Patients and clinician preferences about, I mean, nobody wanted these patients. I don't want to go to the hospital. My love letter to my wife was that I went in and got allergy shots for our pandemic puppy during the pandemic, but in general, people did not want to go, and doctors needed to clear out capacity, right? Reimbursement was made so that telemedicine could be billed or reimbursed at a comparable level to an in-person visit because of the health emergency. You could be certified as a physician in more than one state for the first time because of the emergency, right? All of these things make it feasible to have a robust telemedicine practice. And without that, it will struggle, and this shows this. So now let's turn to the technology, and let's talk a little bit about what it can offer different kinds of stakeholders, especially patients. Digital health is an incredibly broad term. I have one of those fancy exercise bikes, a Peloton. It's an exercise bike with a big iPad stuck on it. People call that a digital health device. It's maybe a bit of a stretch. It does show me a lot of information about my exercise over time, but this is a very broad field. We're going to focus mainly on devices or applications that face patients or physicians or researchers. But obviously, there are things that help on back office functions in hospitals, billing. I'm not really going to talk too much about electronic health records. It's a very, very broad term. As you may know, the ability of things on our wrists or in our clothing or in our smartphones to measure things is rapidly increasing. The big bars on the left are the commodity things that Fitbit gave you for many, many years now. Things like physical activity, maybe your heart rate. But as you look, I've highlighted a few more functions at the top, and these really are their vital signs, their measures of physiology. And so the capacity is certainly expanding. in addition to these, just the ability to have a relatively old-fashioned survey, but that people can complete at home in a quiet moment how they're feeling, right? To give that context in between physician office visits is actually very important. And especially for this conference, um, you know, as many measurements as are possible, as many kinds of surveys and patient reports that are possible, digital health has many potential audiences. And so as you look, I've tried to encapsulate much of the healthcare ecosystem on one slide. And you can step across that cycle from patients to doctors, to health systems, to payers, to communities like yours, and to those engaged in innovation or discovery, like your colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry. Digital touches all of these, right? And so one critical point for which your voice will be important going forward is that there may be a digital solution that has multiple stakeholders, and those stakeholders may have different views of the value of that digital solution. They may want different things from it, right? So, for instance, a CPAP machine to help people with sleep apnea, it can certainly be effective medically. Digital data from a CPAP machine can be sent back to the health insurance company who's paying for it, and certain things can be shown to the patient. And there was a very well publicized misadventure where people had no idea, patients had no idea that the insurance company was getting data on the CPAP machine until they started getting messages that said, looks like you're only using the CPAP machine 2 hours a night. That's not sufficient. We're not going to pay for it anymore, right? And so that's a clear breach of trust for something that had the potential to help patients, to give patients insight, to give people insight, understand, maybe get some disease-related insights and management insights, and instead it veered off into this other direction. And as you know, a recurring theme in healthcare, but especially in digital, is that the person using the device or the solution may not be the person paying for it. And so people developing these solutions, they have to figure out how are they going to navigate these sometimes conflicting concepts of value. And I think a strong patient voice is critical to articulate what the patient community finds valuable about any kind of digital solution. I'm just going to briefly go through a few examples of digital health applications, again, focusing on patients and their interactions with doctors. I think many of you have heard about this. Apple Watch and other devices can give insights into the heart rhythm. So the same little green light that tells you your heart rate from a Fitbit can infer if that heart rate is irregular or too fast for the amount of physical activity that it's recording. And so there's an atrial fibrillation algorithm detection. Multiple devices requires a little light FDA clearance. Parkinson's disease is an example of really clever use of sensors in a smartphone, right? And so this is a tapping speed test. Again, this can be rolled out and you can ask a study participant to do this on a schedule or a few times a week. And it presents two targets on the screen, as you can see here. And it just says, okay, when the chime sounds, tap those two targets as fast as you can. And we measure that. And you can actually see in some patients after they take their medicine, their tapping speed improves, right? So that is something, it's quantitative. It can be measured in between doctor visits. It can be useful for both patients and their treating physicians or providers. So I think this is very, very clever. There's a lot of effort now in voice, either just right now, I think most of the activity is having you either just say, ah, and measuring that, or maybe having you read a canonical passage, right? I think there are a few companies that will just monitor your conversation, but there's a lot of interest, and it makes kind of rough physiologic sense that certain conditions can affect certain qualities of your voice. So these are all examples of kind of more sophisticated digital measurements. How about just facilitating care and making the experience of care better? So this is something that's happened a couple of years ago, and you can now, if your health system participates, you can now download certain aspects of your official health record to your iOS device, right? And so you can see on the right here, these are the, whoops. These are the kinds of conditions that you can download, including medications, immunizations, a diagnosis list. At present, not notes, for instance. But this is really, I think, maybe a crossover hit that presages something great to follow, right? This is taking something in the hospital system where if you wanted something, maybe you'd get, 100 Xerox pages, or maybe you'd get a CD. And now for these kinds of data types, it's on a consumer device, right? That's actually, I think, a very profound change. I don't know about you, but every time I go to the doctor, the first 5 minutes is just asking medication reconciliation, right? If you go to Netflix, there's a button you can push if you don't want to watch the opening credits of a TV show, right? And there have been calculations of the billions of hours that have been saved around the world by that button. Wouldn't you like that 5 minutes back from your doctor's office visit, right? So this is a very profound development. They now have an effort where certain aspects, let's say, of a wearable device, you could even send it back into the electronic health record of your health system, right? So, and this is a little technical for the aficionados. This is being enabled by a lot of work, multiple stakeholders to agree on standards and protocols and something called application program interfaces, or APIs, right? So think about if you if you're doing your taxes and you're on TurboTax and it says, would you like to download your tax form from Fidelity to TurboTax? And you can do that. That's basically APIs that allow you to do that. And so you don't have to provide a whole lot of permission every single time. Healthcare is just starting to dip their toes into that water. And this is, I think, an exciting development. In terms of care, I have two quick examples. This is a digital app for schizophrenia and psychiatry as a supplement to in-person care, right? And so you could imagine that an app through surveys, through just passive measures, researchers are developing something that maybe is a score to predict how likely it is that somebody's, let's say, manic behavior or schizophrenia is getting worse. And they can try to incorporate that when they see the patient in the office. And they can also see, again, in a more continuous way, how have things been since the last time you saw them, right? And instead of saying, great, you're here again, how have the last 6 months been? Right, which is really an unanswerable question. You now have the opportunity to see some kind of information, some context to fill in those gaps between doctor visits. You can take this another step further. This is a spin out of Verily, right? So now Verily is part of the Alphabet or Google family of companies. This is one of their efforts in digital diabetes care. And so you never see any of these providers in person, but they send you a continuous glucose monitor. There's an app. There's, this company has hired diabetes educators and coaches and diabetologists, right? And so this is all virtual care and management of your diabetes. And so just to wrap up this section, obviously there are opportunities to see how people are doing in between doctor or clinic office visits, to move these measurements and the data collection from a clinic room into people's homes where they work or where they play, and to use that data for education or insights. Patient-reported outcomes, I think you're familiar with this concept. Some of you, have you heard about this concept of outcomes-based contracts or risk contracts for expensive new therapies, right? So there's a new hemophilia gene therapy approved in Europe, one and done therapy, 1.5 million euros is kind of the list price. And the company is engaging in kind of outcome-based reimbursement. And so if the benefit wanes after 4 years instead of 5, in theory, you get 20% of the money back. Now, this is a very popular concept for gene therapy, for a lot of these expensive therapies. You are going to need some way other than doctors' visits, I think, to track and declare, are people doing well? Is the therapy still working? Digital solutions will, in all likelihood, be part of that future world. And so there's a direct line between an app that you may have on your smartphone and reimbursement for very expensive therapies in the near future. And then clearly, access is still a limiting factor for access for care, for clinical trial participation. In theory, having a digital app to supplement traditional care can really improve access. Just very briefly for clinical trials, this is an actual clinical trial and a schematic of some study visits. And on this graph, each column is a study visit. And then in black are visits that have to be in person on site. And everything else is virtual, right? Either digital or someone comes to the house. And so in this case, they've taken a study with 10 visits and they've dropped it down to only 4 out of those 10 times does the patient actually have to go to the study site, right? Again, for access, for equity, for just data collection and more robust enrollment, less dropout, this is an important potential advance in the world of clinical trials. And this is a busy slide, but just to say that this is from the Digital Medicine Society. It's a reasonably up-to-date slide. 96 different companies are collecting digital endpoints in their clinical studies. Great curiosity, some uncertainty as to the best way to use these endpoints in their studies, but people in the pharmaceutical or biotech world clearly see the value both to make sure that the study endpoints reflect important aspects of a patient's life, but also to make the burden of trial participation a little easier. Some cautions, and I think many of these will be self-evident. One is what I'll call the digital divide. And so that even as we improve access, we want to make sure that we're not erecting new barriers to the access. You know, in the United States, at least, penetration of smartphones is very high. Over 85% of people in the United States have a smartphone. They may still be, however, functionally illiterate, or they may not have a data plan, right? So you need to take these into account. Rural, urban, differences in education and socioeconomic status, in age, all of these will affect your ability to, well, it'll affect the support you need to make a digital solution successful. Data privacy, I'm going to spend a little bit of time in, and in this digital world, the data privacy is heavily influenced by what's out there in the consumer world. And healthcare, all of us needs to be, I think, a little bit savvy and a little bit skeptical and careful. So this is a study of the New York Times from 2018. And this just tracked a person's, how many times her phone or her laptop sent her location to some other third party. And so you can see there in 4 months, her location was recorded 8,600 times. Some of these were sensitive, healthcare visits, her boyfriend, things like that. On the right is a weather app. And I've seen this alert. It says, do you want this app to access your location? And I just checked today. I actually do let AccuWeather see my location. I don't think this app is AccuWeather. Yes, you're getting some value, right? You're getting a localized weather or pollen report for where you live. But that app was sending it to IBM, who then sold the data to a hedge fund. It would be hard for you to know that that's happening. Again, this is in the consumer world. This is an art installation. I love this image. This person just took the end user agreements, the things that you agree to when you download an app, and you can see these apps. If you have teenagers or whatever, these are popular apps. Let's just leave it at that. He just printed out those agreements in regular 11 or 12-point font, and this is what it is, right? Again, the consumer world. But as I just said, how exciting it is that electronic health records are now on a consumer device. And so the good news is that healthcare has HIPAA. We have safeguards. We're under a lot more scrutiny. The bad news is HIPAA is a very old law. It predates all of this, and anything arising out of a consumer app, right? Anything that doesn't arise with an interaction between a patient and a doctor or a health system or an insurance company, HIPAA doesn't apply. And so we have to be careful of this blurring at that interface and people being put at risk. This is a colleague of mine at Harvard Medical School. He looked at smoking cessation and depression apps. 92% of the apps share data with at least one third party, most of them run by Facebook or Google. And of those, half of them didn't disclose this. So even if you read the fine print, you would not know. So now this is taking it into health apps on a consumer platform that are not protected by HIPAA. This is not to say that these smartphone apps don't offer value to patients in a variety of contexts. But what it means is that, you know, regulatory approaches, technical approaches are not enough. And your voices can contribute meaningfully to really a social contract, right? These companies and to their credit, Google says we are trying to develop a social compact with patient data. And there needs to be transparency about what the data will be used to. Some companies are now doing, consent, not just one time, but consent for individual types of data and individual use. And so if you consent and 3 years later they come up with a new use for your data, they're supposed to come back to you and ask again, can we now use your data for this? And that's the future. I think there will always be bad actors and leakage of data, and it's going to be hard to have an environment where that's prevented. And so it has to be more of this social contract, I think. And again, your voices will have an important role in that. And so I'll end with a preview of some trends in the future. So clearly, as we look, COVID has, I think, changed what we hope for in our healthcare system. And on one end, we saw amazing technology and vaccinations. On the other hand, vulnerabilities and inequities in our health system were laid bare and started a whole new set of conversations. But as you look across all the different ways that healthcare will change and is changing, from reimbursement to artificial intelligence to new therapeutic modalities, digital really is going to be one of those profound sources of change. And I think we've talked about this concept, but value can come from any of the things that I put on this slide. Outcomes, certainly. The traditional definition of value is outcomes divided by cost, right? But people now expand it to experience, quality, safety. The key really is to, just like people question the stethoscope or x-rays, when you're faced with an opportunity to use a new solution, ask, what problem is this solving? Do they really understand the perspectives of key stakeholders? And of those, patients have to be first. I think in a strange way, just like x-rays were helped along by societal changes, the pandemic is resetting all of our expectations for how we want to interact with our healthcare. And so let me just take you through this stepwise. So in the old days, maybe there was, this two-party relationship between patients, families, and the health system or a hospital. And in the pandemic, certainly, even legacy health systems added telemedicine. But there's a whole category of companies that don't have hospitals or clinics, but they can see you, they can diagnose, they can even have prescriptions mailed to your house. Some of them are niche things like him or hers or Rose. Some of you may have seen those, but you could actually now add in this category Amazon, right? Amazon has bought, or they announced their intention to buy One Medical. One Medical has about 800,000 patients in 25 US cities and 800,000 patients, 8,000 employee corporate clients, right? And obviously Amazon bought PillPack, which is an online pharmacy. And so Amazon has the capacity to deliver some in-person care, but really they're a virtual first company. And then think about somebody like Walmart. For those of you who don't know, Walmart is this huge big box retailer in the United States and certain countries around the world. They sell groceries. They have in-store pharmacies, and they're experimenting. A few dozen of their stores now have primary care clinics, dental clinics, and I think optometry or something like that. They have very straightforward pricing. It's like a menu on the wall. And they have their own kind of omni-channel experience. You can have it care through your app, through telemedicine, through a kiosk in the store. And so this dominance of this dyad between a patient and a doctor is now being replaced with this whole ecosystem of places where people can get care. By necessity, what that means is that the patient is more dominant, I think. In theory, has more control over their care. And what it means for data is that we need to find a way so that this data, wherever it was generated, can be applied wherever it's needed, right? If you got a vaccine at CVS, you don't want that information to just stay at CVS. You want it to be sent to NHF so you can get in the door here, right, and collect your admission card. So this is really the future. And I think with some justification, this is edging towards what people expect. And I'll close by returning to some images of patients. I showed you Laennec and the early stethoscope. So this is a drawing by, I think, either a 7 or a 9-year-old girl of a doctor's office visit. And so here's the girl sitting on the table. Here's her family. Everyone's smiling. Where's the doctor? Right? Here's the doctor back to the scene, typing away on the computer. And what's dystopian about this is everyone's smiling. This girl doesn't see anything wrong with that. The doctor's smiling, right? This is a classic example of a digital technology rolling out without considering the user, right? As someone in health IT said to me, no one ever got fired for buying Epic. Apologies if Epic is in the room, right? But Epic is very good at billing. It's not so great for doctors. There's a lot of resentment that, our notes are generated, we're data entry clerks for billing. It's made the profession quite unhappy. This is a painting that typifies doctors being present, right? So now this is taking you back about the era of the invention of the X-rays, when there was already some tumult about introduction of technology into healthcare. And you can see here the patient is a girl lying across pillows on a couple of chairs. It's dark, but her parents are in the background. The mom is sobbing on the bureau. And this is what we want. This is a physician who's fully present, not distracted, giving all his attention to the patient. And my last image is to remind you that this is not a faraway, lost vision of the practice of healthcare. So now I'm going to replace this image with a very modern image. And this was just taken a few years ago. And the person in the white shirt is the physician, and the woman he's talking to is actually homeless, right? And so this visit is in Boston South Station. It's our railroad and bus depot. He will chart this visit. I think they use Epic, right? But in this moment, he's not worrying about that. He's not typing for the note. He's fully present. And I think the vision for all of us is that, digital has to enable this kind of intimacy, this kind of doctor-patient relationship, even as it increases our ability to collect data, maybe, to support pricing for an innovative new therapy. But in the end, this is why, healthcare is not Twitter. This is why healthcare is not Snapchat or any of these digital apps that scale exponentially. And this should be our goal. So with that, thank you for the invitation, and I hope we have a fun discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Testing? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shaw. That was a great presentation. And when I was talking to Dr. Shaw before we started, I mentioned that this is really the introduction to digital health for our community. We have not had this type of presentation previously. So I'm really interested in the audience's response to the presentation and questions that you have at this point. Um, does this resonate with you? What are your thoughts, impressions? Um, I'm actually, because I don't see anybody raising their hand, I'm going to call on somebody sitting in the back who I know has experienced digital health. Marcy, you're going to have to take your little red mask down and tell us about your experience with digital health. So Marcy is one of the NHF employees, and Marcy?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, Dr. Valentino. So I have children with chronic medical conditions and I have them myself. And I have used, I think, just about every digital health platform out there for telemedicine visits. And I've had just about every telemedicine experience you can have, all the way from the super engaged, really phenomenal experience that Dr. Shaw was talking about, where you had the provider able to just spend their time connecting with you because they had a medical assistant in the room whose entire job it was to chart the appointment and take all those records. And so we just got to spend the time one-on-one authentically with the provider, all the way to the provider who has the app crashing. Their dog is loose in the backyard. We can hear it through the window. They're running out to chase the dog during our appointment, coming back in. Then the phone rings and the doorbell rings and the distractions that came with that, to the apps that crash, to the, hey, we can't get the EHR to work, so could you just email the information in? With my background, I'm saying, no, that's not protected health information, so I'm not willing to do that. So kind of all of the gamut. But I can tell you that it's a really exciting space as a person who lives 90 miles from most of our specialists to not have to drive in every single time we have an issue, especially since in the town that we live in, my son's pediatric providers are basically afraid of him. So if we call with a hey, he has an earache, or hey, he has an infection on the side of the fingernail, they tell me to go to the children's hospital. He's almost 18 years old. So he's not 4 and unable to communicate with them. He's a very bright, very vocal kid who is a great medical advocate, but our local providers don't want to see him. So it's an amazing resource to not have to drive 90 miles every single time I need to see a doctor. So it's been a great resource. I don't know, what else would you like me to tell him, Dr. Valentino?
Thanks, Marcy.
Okay.
That's great. So do we have other questions or comments from people in the audience? Got one up in the front. While you're walking up there, I'll tell you about my own personal digital experience. So as you all know, I'm a hematologist. I practiced in Chicago for almost 35 years. I retired in the end of 2013 when our medical center rolled out Epic. And so 2 years into Epic, I decided I am not going to do this, because I was that doctor sitting with my back to the patient because our examining rooms were not configured to be able to do this. They just plopped a computer onto a desk in the room and I had to sit with my back to the patient, and I just couldn't do that. I now go to a subspecialty retinal specialist who I get a retinal scan in one room. By the time I get in to see my retinal specialist, he's already got the retinal scan up on a screen. He's talking to me and examining me while there's another person who's typing into the computer and reading that information from the last visit and correlating back and forth. And they're talking and he's talking to me while he's examining me. Totally different experience than what I had as a practitioner. And I think Dr. Shaw is right. We really need to think about how that interface happens. And we as a community, and you as people who live with bleeding disorders, you need to express your voices on how this gets rolled out and how we do this as a community. So
I also, I'm about an hour and a half away from my for my specialists, and I'm grateful for the platform that I use. I believe it actually is Epic as well, in order to communicate some things with my doctor. But on the flip side, I've noticed that a lot of times the doctors are against a wall from the programmers of Epic, because it doesn't account for every contingency that they want to be able to put in. You know, for instance, allergies, mine is blood thinners. Okay, not aspirin, not ibuprofen, but blood thinners in general. And that's not one of the things that's categorized. And the way Epic was in the beginning was they didn't have a notes section where they can type in something customized. It had to be something from a pre-programmed list, and they just couldn't do it, and it wound up creating problems. But a question also is a lot of doctors' visits is really face-to-face, one-on-one, where they see your color, see how your speech is, see a lot of things that you can only see in a face-to-face venue, not something done on a screen. What are your thoughts about that?
So I think there's certainly a lot that we have to be sure that we don't neglect when we think about more virtual visits. You know, there is just the sense of somebody. My wife does clinical trials for targeted therapies for lung cancer. And in some of her trials, people feel better and they look better in a matter of days, right? And so, sure, it's something that you may not capture. You know, there are efforts on the technology side, which is not really your question, but there's this whole field growing up around remote patient monitoring, right? And so some kind of vital signs to get a heart rate, to get a blood pressure, things like that, that can be important adjuncts to what you just see on the screen. The other thing for clinical trials that your comment reminds me of is sometimes one of the reasons that people enroll in clinical trials is they say, well, gee, even if I get the standard of care, let's say I'm randomized to the standard of care, not the innovative new therapy, I think I'll just be watched over more closely when I'm part of a clinical trial. And there's some truth to that. And so then if you then say to that person, well, half of your trial visits are going to be virtual, we don't really know how people will react. You know, I do think some of the concerns you raise are why the specialty probably with the most excitement, the most investment, the most advanced practice models for digital is psychiatry, right? Because so much of that is in the conversation. One would think there's still nuance there, but I think we're still figuring out some of that.
Thank you.
So I do have a couple questions or comments from the chat. So
yeah.
that's why you see me walking around with my phone to catch up on those. One is that the Band-Aid to move the doctor back into being present is to use scribes, a whole new person, you know, and a whole nother team member, but it is effective as we talked about. And they really enjoyed your presentation. And the next question is, has healthcare informatics proven to be a benefit in telehealth? Or is it seen to be predominantly still something that's to be used in physical bedside and research policies? And they say informatics being the science of processing data for the storage and retrieval of information. Do you want to read it? And would that help? It's a lot of words.
You know, I will say that you know, informatics in general, if I can answer the question this way, right, is going to be hugely important, broadly speaking, when you talk about apps or digital solutions. In the exact case of telemedicine, you know, the analytics on the technical side, there are companies that will just using a computer video image, they can detect subtle changes in your face color and infer a pulse, right? So that's an extreme technical example. But on the other hand, there's a lot of informatics to say to evaluate the quality of those telemedicine visits. And then to, if you have a rich enough, interrogation system, by following your patients, by looking at appointment times and delays in getting appointment, and you should be able to audit and see maybe who called, who was recommended to be seen in 3 months, couldn't get an appointment and diverted to telemedicine. Like, you could start to read out aspects of the patient experience and how they prioritize different factors of convenience or an in-person visit. And I'll just one comment about, the technology. I mean, one of the greatest examples, I think, of powerful informatics or computation is in the image-based artificial intelligence that you're hearing about from places like Google, but others. And they look at, the image of the retina for the eye, and they can diagnose diabetic retinopathy as well as ophthalmologists can, right? And to go one step further, I'll just say that Google, to their credit, has done a nice job figuring out how a tool like that can fit into clinical workflows and where it can add value. So for instance, in Thailand, they actually sat down and just watched and saw new problems crop up with clinician workflow when they introduced this tool in Thailand. And they even found that, in certain countries, in certain practice contexts, it works best to put this tool in the hands of a primary care doc. And in other practice contexts, maybe in another country, it worked best in terms of getting people, follow up for their retinopathy if they put it in the hands of the diabetologist or the endocrinologist. So, how you use these tools so they add the most value is in a way hyper-local. And these companies, I think, are starting to recognize that they need to almost have ethnographic research, deep experiential, observation into the patient experience, to clinical workflows, to use these powerful analytics effectively.
Okay, we have about 1 minute left. I know you had a quick question over here.
We have been discussing for years how there's a dwindling number of hematologists in the United States. And the idea was that telemedicine would be one of the tools available for the general public to access an HTC or a hematologist. Is the regulatory environment beginning to catch up to those realities?
Yeah, so currently, only because of the COVID-19 pandemic were physicians able to see patients across state lines. If once that pandemic is lifted, we will revert back to the case where physicians are restricted to seeing patients within their own state. So that means that our colleague in the back, Marcy, if she wanted to see a specialist, she lives in Washington State. If she wanted to see a specialist in Colorado, she would actually have to do a telemedicine visit in Colorado to be seen. She could not be seen in Washington and have that physician be in Colorado. We've had examples of that with people in our community who've had liver transplants, for example, in another state where they couldn't be seen when they went back home, or they couldn't see their primary care provider or their hematologist who lived in their home state when they were at a transplant site in another state. So no, Dr. Shaw, you have any other comments on that? Yeah. We're not there. It is an area that public policy needs to take up. But it's a bigger issue than the bleeding disorders and blood disorders community. It's a national problem. So I think that brings us to the close. I'd like to thank Dr. Shaw for joining us today. If we could have the last slide. I think we have a QR code for the evaluation. Oh, we have a question here. Yeah, those, okay. So thank you to Dr. Shaw. So here's our evaluation. If you could please scan the QR code. Your comments and input into these sessions is incredibly important. We'd appreciate to have your input. And again, remember that you're using a digital tool right now. So thank you very much for the attending this session.